Hey, what's up everyone? Brandon here from TruckSafe Consulting. In this video, we're going to discuss the FMCSA's new entry-level driver training requirements for CDL drivers and what to expect come February of 2022. So stay tuned, and if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button below so you can stay up to date on all of our new DOT compliance related content. So you may have heard talk about a new entry-level driver training requirement for CDL drivers. That requirement can be traced back to a final rule that was published by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration way back in 2016. Now that final rule and its new requirements were originally set to take effect in February of 2020. However, the agency subsequently delayed its implementation date to February 7th of 2022. So with that date now less than a year away, I thought it would be a good time for a brief refresher on the new entry-level training requirements. But before I get to that, I want to start out by taking a look at what the federal regulations currently require in terms of entry-level driver training. Now, in that regard, I note that the federal rules as they exist currently impose an entry-level driver training requirement on motor carriers who engage CDL drivers who have less than 1 year's worth of commercial driving experience at the time of their initial onboarding. So if I'm onboarding a driver who holds a CDL and has only 6 months worth of experience operating a commercial motor vehicle, then the regulations require that I, as the motor carrier, provide that driver with entry-level driver training on certain topics and then document his or her completion of that training with a certificate in his or her driver file. The topics that must be covered in this current entry-level driver training include driver qualification requirements, hours of service, driver wellness, and whistleblower protections. Now, this type of training is, believe it or not, one of the few instances where the regulations currently impose an affirmative obligation on motor carriers to provide training to their drivers. And as I said, this one only applies to that limited subset of CDL drivers who have less than 1 year's worth of driving experience. So that's what the regulations require currently. Now let's talk about the new entry-level driver training requirements set to go into effect in February of 2022. So the new entry-level driver training requirements set to take effect in February of 2022 set up a system whereby CDL drivers themselves will be required to obtain entry-level driver training from a certified training provider in order to be eligible to take the skills test to obtain their CDL in the first instance. So the onus will be off of the shoulders of the motor carriers that employ CDL drivers and onto the CDL drivers themselves to obtain this training as part of the CDL process. Now, more specifically, the new requirement will apply to the following categories of CDL drivers: those obtaining a Class A or Class B CDL for the very first time, those upgrading an existing Class B CDL to a Class A CDL, and those seeking to obtain school bus, passenger, or hazardous material endorsement to their CDL for the first time. These three categories of drivers will be subject to the new entry-level driver training requirement and will have to obtain the required training in order to complete their CDL transaction. Now, I'll pause here to note that this requirement will not be retroactive, meaning that it won't apply to drivers who already hold a valid CDL or an SP or H endorsement issued prior to February 7th of 2022. In other words, it will only apply to the categories of CDL drivers that I just listed who are seeking to complete those CDL transactions on February 7th, 2022 or after. So what type of new training are we talking about? Well, the regulation sets up a certain core and endorsement curricula that the three categories of drivers will have to take in order to be eligible to complete the skills tests that are necessary to complete their CDL transactions. The curricula will be divided into a theory component and a behind-the-wheel component, and drivers must obtain this training from a training provider that will be listed on the FMCSA's Training Provider Registry, which the agency is currently building out. Now, these training providers will have to develop and provide instruction in all elements of the applicable theory curriculum. So for drivers falling into the category of obtaining a Class A or Class B CDL for the first time, they would have to proceed through a particular curriculum that is tailored for their circumstance. And drivers who fall into the category of obtaining an SP or H endorsement would take a more limited curriculum addressing the issues that are pertinent to those endorsements. Now, the regulation doesn't set any minimum number of hours for the theory or the behind-the-wheel components of this training. However, each driver taking the theory component will be tested and will have to achieve an overall score of at least 80% on the test in order to pass. As for the behind-the-wheel component, drivers will have to complete range and public road segments, which will include discrete maneuvers that the driver must master to the satisfaction of the training provider. Again, there's no minimum hour component to the behind-the-wheel portion, but the driver must pass that portion to the satisfaction of the training provider. And once a driver passes both the theory and the behind-the-wheel components, then the certified training provider will issue a certificate and will electronically upload that certificate to a system that will interface with state licensing agencies so that those agencies know that the driver has passed the requirements and is now eligible to take the appropriate skills test to complete their CDL transaction. Now, in terms of the training providers themselves, those who wish to provide the training will have to be listed on the agency's Training Provider Registry. And in order to be on that registry, the providers will have to self-certify that they meet certain criteria. For example, they will have to certify that they will provide instruction in a training curriculum that meets the minimum standards set forth in the agency's rule, and also meet other eligibility requirements, such as having room and resources to provide the required training. Now, these providers can be dedicated training schools, or also motor carriers that wish to provide the training for their drivers, or state agencies. And once the Training Provider Registry is populated with self-certified providers, CDL drivers will be able to search that registry for providers who are near them. So that's a very high-level summary of the upcoming entry-level driver training requirement. Again, it will apply to certain subcategories of CDL drivers who will have to obtain the training in order to be eligible to take the skills test to obtain their CDLs for the first time, upgrade them from Class B to Class A, or to obtain an S, P, or H endorsement. This new requirement will take the place of the existing entry-level training requirement that places the onus on motor carriers to provide the training to CDL drivers who have less than 1 year's worth of driving experience when first onboarding. So with all of that said, I'll note that the FMCSA is currently working to build the Training Provider Registry, and so I would expect to hear more from the agency about this entry-level driver training in the months to come. So that's going to wrap up this video. I hope you found it useful. Be sure you check out our website at trucksafeconsulting.com, where you'll find all kinds of educational materials on these types of topics, including our ebook, which provides a high-level summary of all of the federal safety regulations. And if you're interested in even more in-depth training on these regulations, make sure you take a look at our online courses over at trucksafeacademy.com. As always, thanks for watching.